heard inflation talked this much since really the 1970s.
That's because over the past few months, prices for everything from gasoline to groceries have been rising sharply as the economy roars back from the pandemic recession. This graph charts the Consumer Price Index, a metric that measures the average change in prices for consumer goods and services compared to a year ago, or more simply put, inflation. In May of this year, prices spiked 5% to reach the highest annual inflation rate in nearly 13 years. Many economists believe that a small amount of inflation, around 2%, is inevitable and even desirable. That's essentially what we've had for the past 15 years before this most recent surge. But these recent increases have some fearing that the US might be returning to the runaway inflation of the 1970s.
No one wants to see that happen again.
So, are we returning to the spiraling inflation of the late 1960s and 1970s? Or is today's inflation, as the Fed assures us, transitory?
This is an extraordinarily unusual time.
For those old enough to remember it, the Great Inflation was a period in which the cost of living for millions of Americans soared. From 1965 to 1982, prices for food and everyday consumer items rose dramatically from 2% in 1962 to 15% in 1979. During that same period, unemployment also rose steadily, eventually reaching just above 10%. The term stagflation, an economic condition of both rising inflation and increasing unemployment, became the go-to phrase to describe the period's economic malaise. This was a time when consumers protested rising meat prices, union members picketed for cost of living pay increases, and long lines for unemployment and gas became commonplace.
Here in New Jersey, 10% of the workforce is unemployed. Across the nation, the average is 8%.
The main lesson from the 70s is that kind of nagging, persistent, recurrent double-digit inflation doesn't happen overnight. It sets in over many years, and it set in because of a long series of policy mistakes in Washington.
The Great Inflation has its roots in the government spending of the 1960s. Consumer prices began rising under President Johnson as he escalated the Vietnam War and launched his Great Society social programs. But the double-digit inflation the period is famous for didn't begin until President Richard Nixon took office.
The time has come for a new economic policy for the United States.
In 1971, Nixon ordered that the dollar would no longer be backed by gold.
Inflation robs every American, every one of you.
Nixon also influenced the Fed's monetary policy, pushing the central bank to pump more money into the economy and keep interest rates low.
By letting inflation rise gradually for a number of years, the Fed compromised the trust the public held that the Fed would maintain price stability. Businesses and households started expecting that inflation would persist.
As prices went up, workers started pressing, in part for unions, and as wages went up, companies started raising prices even more, and we got this game of leapfrog, where prices and wages both went up.
We must whip inflation right now.
These policy missteps continued under President Ford, and later under President Carter, the issue was exacerbated further by OPEC's oil embargoes.
A more serious domestic problem. That problem is inflation.
It wouldn't be until President Jimmy Carter appointed Paul Volcker as the chairman of the Federal Reserve that the Great Inflation finally began to disappear.
Paul Volcker, the Fed chairman, said, "I'm going to stop this cycle." And he clamped down on the growth of money supply, and he jacked up interest rates. It caused two very severe recessions. But that, it turned out to be really what needed to happen to get inflation under control.
Volcker's inflation crackdown represented a new chapter for America's monetary policy.
In the 1960s and 1970s, the Fed did not have an articulated inflation targeting strategy, that inflation should be around 2%. And so they were not focused on keeping inflation under control.
In the 1970s, the Fed was not even willing to commit to what they meant by price stability. It was kind of trust us, we will deliver, which is horrible policy.
Today, we can see some clear similarities between our modern inflationary period and that of the 1970s. Just like the 70s, prices are rising. The Federal Reserve has increased the money supply, and government spending is up. But comparing today's inflation with that of the entire Great Inflation, especially the 1970s, is not accurate.
I graduated from college in 1975. I had a front row seat. Nothing like that. I don't expect anything like that to happen.
Today's inflation and the threat that we have is actually like the last half of the 1960s. It's not like the 1970s. In the mid-1960s, inflation had been running about 2%. By the end of the 1960s, inflation went to about 5%, right? The last inflation reading we had was still below 5%. And so you're nowhere near 20%, which was the highest inflation reading at the end of the 1970s. There's almost no period in the 1970s that had inflation as low as we have now.
Some of the recent spikes in inflation are a very healthy sign of the recovery. What we experienced last year wasn't normal. Take airfares in the airline industry. We had this dramatic drop of airfares that was a sign of the risk that the whole industry would collapse. It's a healthy sign that we see a reversal of those increases today.
For their part, the Fed says it remains committed to its long-held stance that today's inflation is temporary.
The Fed believes that we're having a supply shock. And so that's causing shortages and temporary pricing. That's the Fed's theory.
What we're seeing now, we believe, is inflation in particular categories of goods and services that are being directly affected by this unique historical event that none of us has lived through before, called reopening the economy after closing it.
Every time we have an economic recovery from a recession, we expect to see inflation rise above 2% for a while. That's normal.
If it turns out that these impacts are more than transitory, if they're lasting, they persist, or even increase, then the Fed might have to do something to stop it.
On June 16th, Federal Reserve officials signaled that they expect to raise interest rates by late 2023, sooner than they anticipated in March.
At this point right now,